Camilla Ashgrove leaned back into seat 2 of box 9, legs crossed, her wine untouched on the armrest, and raised one finger straight into Marin Whitlock's face. That finger did not tremble. It pointed at her the way a person points at a stain someone forgot to clean off a new carpet. "You're holding the wrong ticket, sweetheart. Step aside." Marin did not step aside. She stood in the narrow aisle, one hand steadying her 79-year-old grandmother's elbow, the other holding a leather violin case worn pale with age, her gray wool coat frayed at the elbows, and standing exactly 1 arm's length from that red silk dress. 60 people in the honor boxes of the Ardmore Theater turned to look, then one by one found something deeply interesting in their programs. Not one of them said a word. But at the far end of the aisle, shoulder against the red velvet doorframe, a man in a black wool coat and no tie had been standing there for 4 minutes, an old leather briefcase in his hand, and he had not blinked once. His name was not on the guest list. He had not bought a ticket. He had come in through the alley door and back, the same door his mother had walked through every night for 22 years to scrub this very floor. And inside that briefcase was a contract selling the entire building, already signed, waiting only for the day it changed hands. 10 minutes later, the house lights came up full. The orchestra was ordered to lower their instruments in the middle of tuning, and every guest in the honor boxes was asked to leave their seat because of what that silent man actually was. If you believe a person's worth is not measured by the coat they are wearing, leave a comment, hit like, share this, subscribe to our channel, and stay with me to the very last line. A day earlier, on the 41st floor of the Ashgrove Capitol building, Marin Whitlock had finished arranging the schedules of 7 people before the sun had even reached the eastern glass. She booked 3 car rides, moved 2 calls, and sent flowers to the wife of a business partner because that day was their 31st wedding anniversary, a detail the husband himself had forgotten and would never know who had reminded him. She had done that every day for 4 years. Her full name was printed on the nameplate fixed to the corner of her desk, but inside that building, people called her by 3 words. What's her name? What's her name? Get me a coffee, no sugar. What's her name? Is anyone in conference room 4 yet? She had stopped correcting them in the fall of her 2nd year. Not because it didn't bother her, but because every correction meant watching someone's face go blank for 1 second before they smiled and brushed it away, and that 1 second was more exhausting than being called the wrong name. In the evenings, she stayed late. The company paid extra for transcribing the minutes of late meetings, $18 an hour, and she took every shift no one else wanted. 14 straight months of it. 14 months of typing out the words of men discussing numbers she would never see in her own life. Typing until 2 fingers on her left hand went numb for another reason, a very old reason she no longer allowed herself to think about. She brought food from home. She took the green line instead of calling a car even when hail was falling. 3 times in 1 year, she put off replacing the scratched pair of glasses she wore. And when there was finally enough money in the envelope, she bought 2 honor box tickets for the reopening night of the Ardmore Theater. Seats 1 and 2, box 9. She didn't keep them in her wallet. She kept them in a small tin box whose hinged lid had broken off. The same box her mother had once used to store rosin, with a fine layer of amber dust still clinging to the inside that no amount of wiping could completely remove. The box rested in the bottom drawer beneath a layer of handkerchiefs. During those 14 months, she opened it exactly twice. Not because she didn't want to look, because she was afraid the paper would crease along the fold, afraid the ink would fade beneath the sweat of her fingers, afraid that something very small would be ruined before that night had the chance to arrive. Some people hold on to hope by looking at it every day. Marin held on to hope by closing the lid. The apartment she shared with her grandmother was in Pilsen, on the 7th floor of a building with no elevator, its windows facing a red brick wall, painted with the image of a bird that had already faded before Marin was born. That evening, when she came home, Rosalind Whitlock was sitting at the dining table with the newspaper open upside down in front of her. "What day is it today, sweetheart?" "Friday, Grandma." Her grandmother nodded and turned a page. About 5 minutes later, she asked again, her voice just as gentle as it had been the first time, and Marin answered exactly as she had the first time. "Friday, Grandma." The third time came while Marin was washing the dishes. She didn't turn around. She said, "Friday," and heard the newspaper turn another page behind her. Then the old woman began to sing. There was no accompaniment, and there were no words, only 4 measures, softly, barely more than breath-given sound. Marin had heard those 4 measures since she was a child, so many times that she couldn't remember when she had first heard them. Her grandmother didn't miss a single note, not even by a quarter tone. The woman who had asked 3 times in 20 minutes what day it was had preserved 4 perfect measures from the concerto her daughter used to play, keeping them somewhere inside her mind that the illness hadn't yet managed to reach. Delphine Rouse, who lived in the apartment across the hall, watched Rosalind during the day. She was 70 years old, widowed, with a right knee that cracked whenever the weather changed and a memory so good it was almost worth envying. In return, Maren paid for her blood pressure medication. Neither woman had ever called it an arrangement. 3 months earlier, at a clinic on Ashland Street, the doctor had sat down instead of remaining on his feet, which Maren knew was a bad sign before he even opened his mouth. He didn't use any big words. He only told her that what was coming would come slowly, but surely, and then he said one sentence she had carried with her ever since. "You've got about 1 more season before she's no longer herself." Maren had thanked him. She had gone out to the bus, sat down, and ridden 3 stops past her own. That night, after her grandmother had gone to sleep, Maren stood in the kitchen with both palms pressed flat against the old plastic tabletop and counted backward from 10. She counted very slowly. By 3, her breathing had steadied. By 1, she wiped her face with the cuff of her sleeve, opened the cabinet, took out the cookie tin, and walked back into the living room with a smile already in place before her grandmother had the chance to look up. In the corner of the room, leaning against the foot of the cabinet, stood her mother's faded leather instrument case, with the latch on the left side loose since the previous winter, something Maren kept meaning to take somewhere to have repaired. That same afternoon, 11 miles west of Pilsen, in the room above a bakery in Cicero, 6 men sat around a long wooden table, and a 7th man stood. No one had told him to stand. No one had pulled out a chair for him either. The room smelled of baking flour rising through the wooden floorboards, a warm, gentle scent almost absurdly out of place beside the things that were usually said there. The man standing was named Dorsey. He was 42 years old, managed 3 warehouses on the south side, and had spent 7 minutes explaining a shortage of money, speaking in the voice of a man shoveling sand into a hole he knew was far deeper than the amount of sand he had. Gideon Marchetti sat at the head of the table, his chair turned slightly at an angle, one hand resting on the wood, the other hanging loosely at his side. He let Dorsey finish. He didn't interrupt him once, and that alone made those 7 minutes feel as long as a season. When Dorsey finally stopped, Gideon asked his first question, his voice as calm as if he were asking what time a train left. "Did you count the warehouse on Tuesday or Wednesday?" Dorsey said Tuesday. Gideon nodded, let the silence settle for about 3 beats, then asked the second question. "Then whose truck left the yard Monday afternoon?" Dorsey opened his mouth, closed it again, then gave a name. Gideon still didn't change his posture. For a moment, he looked down at his own hand, like a man checking a calculation he had finished long ago, then asked the third question. And the third question wasn't about trucks or ledgers. He said, "Your mother still living in that house on Austin Street?" No one in the room moved. Rafferty Doyle, sitting on the left, set his glass down very softly, and Dorsey, who had just spent 7 minutes lying smoothly, and without hesitation, suddenly heard his own voice giving the real number, the full number, though no one had forced him, no one had threatened him, and no one had even stood up. He said it the way a man vomits up something that has been sitting in his stomach too long. 31,400, over 4 months. Gideon gave a single nod. He said, "You bring it back by Sunday?" Then reached for the black wool coat draped over the back of his chair, settled it over his shoulders, and walked toward the door. He said nothing else about the consequences. He made no promises and no threats. The door closed behind him with a small click. His footsteps descended the wooden stairs, and then there was silence. And Dorsey, who had been standing from the beginning, had to reach for the back of a chair and lower himself into it because his knees could no longer hold him up. Rafferty followed Gideon down to the bottom of the stairs. He was 63 years old, with white hair, walked with a slight lean because of a replaced hip, and had walked behind 3 generations of men in this family. He said, "The lawyer's waiting for you at the coffee shop at 4 o'clock. Gideon said he knew. Rafferty studied him for a moment, then added, "You sure about this?" Gideon didn't answer that. He only gave the old man a light pat on the shoulder, then stepped out into the November afternoon in Chicago, where the wind off the lake pushed backward through the streets and made everything look grayer than it really was. The coffee shop stood directly across from the Ardmore Theater, a little place with 6 tables and an old machine that sounded like a train. Gideon sat down. The lawyer opened his briefcase, spread the papers across the table, and pointed to 3 places marked with small yellow tabs. Gideon signed all 3. He didn't read them again because he had already read them 2 weeks earlier. and because reading them one more time wouldn't have done anything except prolong the feeling sitting inside his chest at that moment. The lawyer said a few things about the timeline, the buyer, and the transfer procedures. Gideon listened and nodded in the right places, and throughout the entire conversation he kept looking through the window, across the street, where workers were removing the last sheet of covering from the limestone facade of the Ardmore, revealing the newly restored gold lettering beneath it. He paid for the coffee. He picked up his leather briefcase and crossed the street, but he didn't head toward the main entrance, where the lights were already on, and people had begun lining up beneath the marquee. He went around to the alley behind the building. The artist's entrance was still the old door, painted blue, with a dent in the lower right corner left by a piano cart so many years ago that no one remembered when it had happened. Inside was a narrow hallway lined with white tile, and he walked through it slowly. The very same hallway his mother had walked every night for 22 years, carrying a bucket of water and a mop, walking it after everyone else had gone home, and the entire building held nothing but the sound of the heating system. He didn't stop anywhere. He went straight out to the orchestra seating, stood at the end of the aisle for a while, then sat down in seat C14, because it was the only empty seat left in the entire section. Camilla Ashgrove carried in her wallet a thin brass season patron card, her name engraved on the front, and a line of text on the back, stating that the cardholder was entitled to priority access to designated areas. For 3 consecutive seasons, that card had meant Box 9. No one had ever put that arrangement in writing. No one had ever needed to. She arrived, showed the card, and someone escorted her to Box 9, Seat 2, on the left, with a direct view down toward the first string section. And in all 3 of those seasons, not once had anyone been sitting there before her. But the Ardmore had just been closed for 11 years for restoration, and when it reopened, the new board had done something both very simple and very significant. For the first time in the building's history, every honor box had been released for individual ticket sales. A notice had been sent to the former patrons. That letter was sitting in the inbox of a junior assistant on the 39th floor, who had marked it important, forwarded it upward, and somewhere between 2 floors, it had disappeared, in the way things always disappeared inside companies that had grown too large. So when Camilla walked up to the box level that evening, she genuinely believed the seat belonged to her. That was what made everything that followed far more uncomfortable than it would have been if she had simply been acting entitled. Nella Pruitt was 26 years old, working her first season as an usher, and she held Marin's ticket beneath the amber wall light for 4 full seconds. She read the seat number. She read the box code. She even read the small line in the lower corner stating that the seat had been locked at the time of purchase and that the buyer had paid an additional fee to secure it. There was nothing wrong with the ticket, and Nella knew that as clearly as she knew her own name. Then she looked up at the woman in the red silk dress, standing 4 steps away, looked at the 2 assistants behind her, looked at the brass card being held out at eye level, and she did what people often do when they're only 26 and still in their probationary season. She said she'd like permission to call her supervisor, then walked to the house phone at the end of the corridor and turned her back on the box while she spoke. Curtis Ballard arrived in less than 2 minutes, wearing a wine-colored tie, his employee badge clipped to his chest, and the hurried expression of a man who had just been pulled away from something else and intended to resolve this in a minute and a half. He greeted both sides with equal politeness. He said the system was showing a conflict on the seat. He said that when there was a conflict, the theater resolved it, according to original issuance. He said the original issuance was showing on the patron's side. He said all of that in about 20 seconds, in the even voice of a man reciting words he had learned by heart. And during those 20 seconds, he didn't look at the ticket in Marin's hand even once. Marin didn't raise her voice. She remained exactly where she was, her left hand still supporting Rosalind's elbow, and asked, "What's wrong with the ticket I'm holding?" Curtis said, "Ma'am, this is a system issue. It isn't an issue with you." She asked again, more slowly than before. "What's wrong with the ticket I'm holding?" Curtis said he understood that the situation was upsetting and that he would find a way to accommodate her. She let that sentence settle completely. Then she asked a 3rd time, and the 3rd time her voice was even softer than the first 2, so soft that the person seated in the row immediately to the right of the box had to tilt his head to hear her. "Pick it up, read it, then show me where it's wrong." A silence followed that lasted longer than ordinary silence should have. Rosalind turned to her granddaughter and asked whether they were changing seats, and Marin said, "No, Grandma, we're sitting here," her voice still as ordinary as if they were talking about the weather. Camilla lowered the brass card and told Curtis that she had sat there for 3 seasons. Curtis said, "Yes, ma'am, I know. And Curtis Ballard, 49 years old, 19 years in the business, a man who had once driven 60 miles through a snowstorm to return a hearing aid someone had left behind, knew perfectly well, somewhere inside his own head, exactly what sentence he needed to say at that moment. The sentence anyone who had read the theater's policy knew by heart, that custom wasn't a contract. He knew it. He had already formed it completely in his mind, but he didn't say it. He stood there between the two women, surrounded by 60 people pretending to read their programs, and looked down at the toes of his own shoes. Curtis Ballard picked up the phone and called the box office, and when he set the receiver down, his face had changed. He said the entire theater was sold out that night, with exactly one seat left, 4th level, back row, against the wall, behind the support column on the left. He added that the sound was still good from there, that the acoustics in this building carried beautifully. Marin asked what he meant by one seat. He said, "I mean 1 seat, ma'am." Then he said the rest a little faster, the way people quicken their steps through a puddle, explaining that the elderly lady could remain exactly where she was. In seat 1, no one would disturb her, and the theater staff would take very good care of her throughout the performance. Someone would bring her water, someone would keep an eye on her. He said the words, "very good care," with genuine sincerity. That was the worst part of the entire sentence. Marin was silent for about 3 breaths. Then she asked, "Do you have a mother, Mr. Ballard?" Curtis said yes. She asked how old she was. He said 81. She asked whether his mother still remembered his name. Curtis didn't answer. Marin said, "My grandmother remembers mine tonight. Tomorrow morning, I don't know. So I'm not leaving her alone in a building where she can't remember how to find the exit. And I'm not going up to the 4th level. Read my ticket again, please. And then we'll keep talking." That was when Camilla Ashgrove reached over the railing of the box. The instrument case was leaning in the open space beneath seat 2, where the person sitting there might ordinarily leave a handbag. Camilla took hold of the handle, lifted it with one hand, and dropped it over the railing onto the aisle below, with the casual motion of someone clearing away something another person had forgotten. The case fell about 5 feet, struck the carpeted step, bounced once, then slid down 2 more steps before coming to rest at an angle beside the edge of a row of seats. The latch on the left, the one that had been loose since the previous winter, sprang open. The lid gaped about the width of a hand. A small cake of rosin, wrapped in a piece of blue flannel, rolled out, traveled down 3 steps, and stopped. A photograph slid out after it and landed face down on the carpet. Rosalind made a sound. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a word. It was only a very short sound escaping from the chest of a 79-year-old woman, and in the honor box section of the Ardmore Theater that night, all 60 people heard it. Marin didn't rush down. She very slowly removed her hand from her grandmother's elbow, placed Rosalind's hand on the arm of the chair, and said, "Hold on here for me, Grandma." Then she turned and walked down the steps. She walked normally. She reached the case, lowered herself onto one knee on the carpet, and began. She picked up the rosin first, brushed the surface of the flannel with her thumb, folded it along the old creases, and placed it back into the small compartment on the right side of the case. She picked up the photograph, turned it over, wiped a streak of dust from one corner with the back of her hand, then slipped it beneath the lining. She pulled the lid back into place and pressed down on both ends until they aligned. She snapped the right latch shut. It caught immediately. She pressed the left latch, and it slipped loose. She adjusted the edge of the lid and tried again. It slipped loose again. She lifted the lid about 1/2 inch, nudged the catch with her thumb, lowered it, and pressed the latch a 3rd time. This time it held. During all of that, not one person in the box section said a word. There was no rustle of programs being turned, no sound of a glass touching a tabletop. There was only the heating system running inside the walls and the strings below on stage tuning one note at a time, knowing nothing at all. Marin stood, cradled the case in both arms, and walked back up the steps. She placed it in Rosalind's lap. The old woman looked down, ran her fingers along the latch on the left, and said, "This one's been loose for a long time, sweetheart." Marin said, "I know. I'll fix it." Then she crouched beside the chair until she was level with her grandmother's eyes and said, "Listen to me, Grandma. I have to go upstairs for a little while. I need you to count 300 beats for me. Count slowly, like 2/4 time." Rosalind asked, "And then what?" Marin said, "When you reach the last beat, look down at the stage." The old woman asked, "And then what?" Marin said, "Then you'll see something." Rosalind nodded the way people nod at a promise they don't understand, but still believe, and she began counting immediately, softly, tapping the tip of one finger against the lid of the instrument case. Down on the orchestra level, in row C, seat 14, Gideon Marchetti had been sitting perfectly still for 4 minutes. He had seen everything. He had seen the brass card raised in the air. He had seen the manager look down at his shoes. He had seen the case fall, and the woman in the gray sweater kneel to pick up every single thing, and he couldn't make himself stand. His right hand was still resting on the armrest exactly where it had been since the moment he sat down, and he couldn't lift it, because what was unfolding before him in that box was something he had seen once before, in this very building, on a winter night, a very long time ago, and that time he had been only 9 years old. The seat on the 4th level was exactly as Curtis Ballard had described it, back row, against the wall, with a cast-iron support column blocking precisely 1/3 of the stage on the left. Marin sat down, placed her bag on her lap, and remained still like that for about half a minute. Then she took a ballpoint pen from the outer pocket of her bag, turned the program over, and began writing on the blank back in the small, perfectly even handwriting of someone who had spent 4 years taking meeting minutes. Handwriting with no flourishes, and that never touched the margins. 1. Usher took the ticket, read the ticket, determined internally that it was valid, then called a supervisor. 2. House manager used the phrase, system conflict 3 times. Original issuance once. Did not pick up the ticket. Did not read the ticket. 3. Asked to separate from a relative suffering memory loss, accompanied by a promise that she would be well cared for. 4. Seat had been locked at the time of purchase. Locking fee paid. Reassigned after the guest had already taken the seat. 5. Personal property was removed from the seating area by a third party and dropped into the aisle. She stopped there. She looked at those 5 lines, then at the blank space beneath them, and she looked at that empty space far longer than it should have taken to think of a sentence. In that blank space, she saw a bus stop on Ashland Street, a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic, a man in human resources 4 years earlier telling her that the title of senior executive assistant wasn't in that year's budget, though the workload would remain exactly the same, and she had said, "Yes, I understand." Then she lowered the pen and wrote the final line. I didn't argue. Not this time either. Down on the orchestra level, Gideon Marchetti stood up. He didn't walk toward the boxes. He went the other way, out toward the side entrance, where Otis Fairbanks was guarding the left aisle, the most senior usher in the building, 15 years on the job, close, cropped salt and pepper hair, a red vest with the theater emblem sewn over the left side of his chest. Gideon reached into the inside pocket of his coat and took out a white card. No name, no symbol, only a sequence of 11 embossed digits centered on it. He handed it to Otis and said, "Take this up to the control room. Tell them to enter it in the owner command field." Otis looked at the card, then at the man in the black wool coat with no tie, then back at the card. He was about to say something about the performance being moments away from starting. He didn't. There was something in the way the man stood that made the sentence dissolve in his mouth before it ever came out. Otis climbed 2 flights of the spiral staircase and entered the small room behind the lighting rig, where Wendell Hoyt sat in front of 3 monitors with his headset hanging crooked over one ear. Otis read out the number. Wendell typed it in. The center screen went dark for 1/3 of a second, then came back with a single line of amber text, centered in the frame. Only one line, accompanied by an exclamation mark inside a square. Wendell Hoyt had sat in that room for 15 years. He knew every command code in that system, even the ones that were never used. Even the fire code, and the evacuation code, and the full system power shutdown code. He had never seen this line once in his life. He read it twice. Then he took his hands off the keyboard and sank back against his chair, and for about 4 seconds he said nothing. After that, he reached for the intercom button and spoke in a voice he didn't recognize as his own. "Bring up all house lights. Right now." The light came down over everything at once. Not the soft glow used while guests were taking their seats, but the flat white light used for cleaning and inspections. The kind of light that exposed every face in the auditorium completely. Down in the orchestra pit, the assistant conductor looked up, turned around, then raised one hand to shoulder height, and the entire string section lowered their instruments in the middle of tuning, leaving a single, sustained A from the oboe hanging in the air before it faded away. 1,400 people began turning their heads to look at one another. 3 minutes later, Inspector Orrin Baskett entered through the main doors with a young police officer named Vance behind him, still holding a radio in one hand. The report he had received on the way over said there was a disruptive patron on the 4th level, refusing to leave her seat. He had handled around 200 incidents like that in 26 years, and he walked in with the exact pace of a man who knew this would cost him 15 minutes. He made it 7 steps down the center aisle. Then he saw the man standing at the end of the left aisle, wearing a black wool coat, no tie, carrying an old leather briefcase. Orrin Basket stopped. He didn't take out his notebook. He didn't lift a hand to the brim of his cap. He turned halfway toward the young officer behind him and said very quietly, "Go outside. Call the chief. Don't touch anything." Curtis Ballard had reached the lobby by then, still holding his radio, and he walked straight toward the inspector, with the relief of a man who had just seen someone arrive to clean up the mess for him. He said, "Sir, we have a patron on the 4th level who refuses to cooperate." Basket didn't look at him. Curtis followed the inspector's gaze, saw the man in the black wool coat, standing at the end of the left aisle, and asked the question he would remember for the rest of his life. He asked, "Who is that?" Orrin Basket didn't answer loudly, but he didn't bother lowering his voice either, and in that brightly lit, utterly silent auditorium, his answer traveled much farther than he intended. He said, "You just asked me a question I haven't finished answering in 9 years." Something moved through the crowd after that. Not a sound, but a change in posture. Dozens of people sitting a little straighter at the same time. Camilla Ashgrove had come down from the box level and was standing on the landing, her 2 assistants having instinctively fallen back about 3 steps behind her. Marin came down from the 4th level empty-handed, the program folded in half and tucked beneath one arm, and when she reached them, she told Curtis that her grandmother was still sitting up there alone and that she wanted him to send someone to stand beside her. She said it in an ordinary voice, the same voice she had used all evening. Camilla turned. She looked at Marin, and something happened across her face. Slowly, layer by layer, like water receding from sand. She said, "You're the one who calls me every morning?" Marin said, "For 4 years, ma'am." Camilla said, "I." Then she stopped. Marin said, "You always hang up before I finish the sentence. I'm used to that too. But you remember the voice. You just never turned around to look at the desk in the corner of the hallway, to the right of the elevators." Camilla Ashgrove couldn't say anything. She stood there with the brass card still in her hand, and looked like someone who had just realized she had been reading a name wrong for 4 years, and no one had bothered to correct her. The side door opened. A woman with short silver hair stepped inside, wearing a gray overcoat and carrying a tablet, and walked directly toward Gideon. It was Margot Ellery, General Counsel, 52 years old, who had received the call while halfway through dinner at home and had walked out the door without changing her clothes. Gideon said, "Pull up the seat record. Read it aloud." Margot read. Her voice was perfectly flat, without emphasis on a single word, and because of that, every word seemed to carry twice the weight. Seat 2, Box 9, sold online 14 months ago. Purchaser M. Whitlock, seat locking fee paid, status locked. Seat 1, same box, same purchase, companion flag attached, registered relative, designated non-separable. First access from House Management Console, Supervisor Account C, Ballard, companion flag manually removed. Seat 2 overridden and reassigned to C. Ashgrove. She paused for 1 beat, then she read the final line. Supplemental status entered into purchaser record, all capital letters. Guest voluntarily accepted seat change. Margot looked up and explained what that line did, because there were 1,400 people in the auditorium, and no one besides her understood it. She said that once that box was checked, the system treated the guest as having agreed, and when the guest agreed, the theater owed the guest nothing. The complaint was closed. The automatic refund obligation dropped to 0. No one had to review it again. Then she added 1 more sentence, and that was the sentence that made the entire lobby fall silent. This line was entered before Miss Whitlock sat down in the new seat. She hadn't even been escorted to the 4th level yet, and the paperwork was already finished. Gideon turned toward Curtis Ballard. He didn't raise his voice. He asked, "Why did you do it?" Curtis said, "The system showed a conflict." Gideon said, "I didn't ask about the system. I asked you." Curtis said, "I had a performance that had to start on time." Gideon said, "That's still not the question I asked. You stood between those 2 women for 15 minutes. You knew exactly what the right sentence was. Tell me why you didn't say it." Curtis Ballard stood motionless for about 5 beats. Then he spoke, and his voice broke halfway through the sentence. "I moved her because she couldn't do anything to me. It wasn't the system. It wasn't any conflict. I looked both of them over from their shoes to their faces, and I chose the one who couldn't fight back." Curtis Ballard's words fell onto the marble floor and lay there, and no one picked them up. Nella Pruitt stood at the foot of the box staircase, both hands clasped tightly in front of her stomach, her eyes fixed on one point in the carpet. The assistant conductor had climbed out of the orchestra pit and was standing at the edge of the stage with 4 musicians. No one had told them to come up, but no one told them to go back down either. And in that silence, Camilla Ashgrove set the brass card on the coat check counter, smoothed the fabric of her dress over one hip, and straightened. She said, "I'd like to say one thing." Basket was about to stop her. She didn't wait to be stopped. She turned toward the honor boxes above, where all 60 people were still sitting in their seats, because no one dared to be the first person to stand up and leave. And she said, "I know that within half an hour, everyone in this room will go home with a very neat story. There'll be a cruel rich woman, a decent woman who was mistreated, an old lady, and an instrument case. Put those 4 things side by side, and the story practically tells itself. I understand why everyone likes that arrangement." She paused, and her gaze moved along the railing above without settling on anyone in particular, and that was exactly what made it hurt most. "But I want to say one thing before you finish putting the story together. For the last 10 minutes, not one of the 60 people sitting up there said a word. Not one. You heard everything. You heard her ask the same question 3 times. You heard the manager say there was only 1 seat left in the entire theater, and that he intended to leave the old woman sitting there alone. You knew it was wrong from the very first sentence. And somehow every one of you found something incredibly interesting in your program." She didn't raise her voice once. That was what made it land. "Now I'm the villain. And tomorrow there'll be a picture of me somewhere. And all of you will feel much better. But you'll feel better because of what I am, not because of anything you did. You sat still until the exact moment sitting still became uncomfortable. So please don't build a story where there's 1 villain here and 59 decent people. There's 1 villain here and 59 very quiet people." No one answered. Gideon Marchetti stood 4 steps away, and he said nothing, and that silence weighed more than any rebuttal could have. Up in the boxes, one man bent down to retie a shoelace that was already tied. A woman lifted her glass of water and set it back down without drinking. Then, on the orchestra level, 9th row on the right, there was the sound of a seat folding up. Amos Pike stood. He was 68 years old, his shoulders still broad from his working years, with 31 years in the city fire department behind him, and he had come to the performance because his daughter had given him the ticket for his birthday. He took the knit cap he was holding and twisted it in his hands. He said, "She's right." Everyone turned to look at him. He said, "I was sitting right by the aisle. About 10 minutes ago, this woman walked past me on her way up to the 4th level. I saw her go by. I saw her face. I had exactly 1 thought in my head. I thought, this isn't right. Then I had a second thought. I thought, somebody'll take care of it. And then I stayed in my seat. I pulled my legs in so she could get past. And I said, 'Excuse me, ma'am.'" His voice turned rough. "For 31 years, I went into places other people were running out of. 31 years. Tonight I pulled my legs in and said, 'Excuse me, ma'am.'" He sat down. No one applauded. No one said anything. Marin Whitlock stood at the foot of the box staircase, the folded program still tucked beneath her arm, and looked up toward where her grandmother was sitting in seat 1, where a 79-year-old woman was still tapping 1 finger against the lid of the instrument case, counting, completely unaware of anything that had happened in all of this. Nella Pruitt was sent upstairs to sit beside Rosalind, and she climbed the stairs at exactly the pace of someone grateful to have something she could do with her hands and feet. Then Gideon Marchetti told Marin that he wanted to show her something, and he led the way down the service staircase behind the coat check counter, down 2 floors, to a gray-painted steel door whose handle had been worn smooth. Behind it was the costume storage room. The ceiling was low, the lights fluorescent, and iron racks stretched for 30 yards, crowded with coats, hats, and evening gowns, sealed inside cloudy plastic garment bags. Along the eastern wall stood gray metal archive boxes, stacked 3 high, holding every original record the building had kept since the day it opened. Gideon set his leather briefcase on a fabric cutting table and said, "My mother cleaned that hallway upstairs for 22 years. He said her name was Serafina. She came in through the alley door at 9:30 at night and left at 2 o'clock in the morning. And in all those 22 years, she had never once sat down to watch a performance there. He said she never complained about it. And he wasn't telling Marin the story so anyone would feel sorry for her, because his mother wouldn't have liked that. He said, 'I'm telling you because there was one winter.'" He leaned 1 hip against the edge of the cutting table and told the rest plainly, in the voice of a 34-year-old man recounting something long past, without adding a single word to make it sadder than it really had been. That year, his mother had saved enough to buy the 2 cheapest tickets for Christmas Eve. Back row, 3rd level. She wore the best coat she owned. Mother and son took their seats. Then a group of invited guests arrived late. And the manager that night came over to them, spoke very politely, and asked the two of them to wait in the hallway for a little while so the seating could be rearranged. His mother stood up immediately. She took his hand and walked out, and she didn't ask a single question. And in the hallway she said something to him that he still remembered word for word. She said, "We don't argue, sweetheart. If we argue, they won't let us back in next time." They stood in the hallway for about 15 minutes. Then the backstage door opened, and a woman stepped out, still holding her violin bow, one of the violinists in the resident orchestra. She took off her scarf and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders, then pressed 2 tickets into his mother's hand, her own complimentary tickets. 7th row, center section. She said exactly 1 sentence, and went back inside. She said, "Don't leave. This place belongs to you more than it belongs to them." Gideon said he and his mother stayed for the entire performance. He said his mother sat with her back straight from beginning to end, as though she were in church. He said he fell asleep during the 3rd movement, and when the performance ended, his mother had to shake him awake, and all the way home she kept saying that the 2nd horn had come in half a beat too early, as if she were some kind of critic, and she laughed the entire walk to the bus stop. He said, "I never knew that woman's name. I've been looking for her for 25 years. Then he fell silent. Maren stood beside the rack of coats with both hands in the pockets of her sweater, and she let the story rest there for a while before speaking. She said, "You were sitting in row C, seat 14. You saw everything from the beginning." Gideon said, "Yes." She said, "You had a code in your coat pocket, a code no one in this building had seen in 15 years, and you were carrying it from the moment you sat down. You could have stopped what happened in 10 seconds. You waited until the case hit the floor before you stood up." Gideon didn't argue. He could have said that he wanted to see how far his own system would go, and that would have sounded neat, perhaps even noble. He didn't say that. He told her the truth, and the truth was worse. He said, "I wasn't calculating anything. I couldn't move. I saw the old woman stand up, and the other woman raise that card, and I sat there. And for exactly 10 minutes, I was 9 years old again. My hand was on the armrest, and I couldn't lift it. You can call that whatever you want, but don't call it a plan, because it wasn't." Maren nodded once, very slowly. She said, "I understand." Then she said, "I still don't forgive you." She said, "Do you know how long my grandmother sat up there alone? Exactly those same 10 minutes. You can buy this whole building. You can buy the seat, the box, the roof over my head. You can't buy back those 10 minutes for my grandmother, and my grandmother doesn't have many 10 minutes left." Monday morning, Maren arrived on the 41st floor at 6:45, just as she always did, and her badge wouldn't open the glass doors. The security guard at the desk downstairs said, "I'm only following the list, ma'am." By noon, the email arrived, 3 paragraphs, signed by Human Resources, using the phrase, "paid suspension pending internal review," and in the 3rd paragraph there was a reference to the confidentiality agreement she had signed 4 years earlier, phrased very carefully, without a single threatening word, and still clear enough for anyone to understand. That afternoon, a call came from an unfamiliar number, asking whether she had reconsidered. She asked, "Reconsidered what?" The caller hung up. Wednesday night, close to 10 o'clock, there was a knock on the door of the 7th floor apartment in Pilsen. The man standing outside was around 50, wearing a custom-tailored overcoat and carrying a slim leather briefcase. He introduced himself as outside counsel for the corporation and apologized for the hour. He didn't come inside. He stood right there at the threshold and did his job quickly and cleanly. A check was placed on top of the shoe cabinet. The amount written in black ink, enough to pay off all her credit card debt, cover 6 months of medical bills, and still leave more money than she had ever had at one time in her life. Beside it were 2 pre-printed documents. The first said that she acknowledged the events of that evening had resulted from a technical error in the ticketing system, and that no individual was personally at fault. The second said that she would not speak to the press, attorneys, or any investigative agency about anything related to the matter. He said everything could end here. No one would have to go to court, and no one would have to lose anything else. He said she could think about it until morning. Maren looked at the check for about 4 seconds. She thought about the tin box in the bottom drawer. She thought about the sentence the doctor had spoken at the clinic on Ashland Street. Then she picked up all 3 sheets, aligned their edges neatly, and handed them back to him. She said, "Go back and tell them one thing for me. My grandmother isn't a technical error." She closed the door. She didn't lock it immediately. She stood behind it and listened to his footsteps descend all 7 flights of stairs before she turned the deadbolt. The following night, a dark-colored car parked across the street from the main entrance of the building, its lights off, and no one got out. It stayed there for about 3 hours, then left. The next night, it came back and parked in exactly the same place. On the third night, Delphine Rouse knocked on the door at 9 o'clock and said, "Sweetheart, that car's down there again. I've seen it 3 nights now. I don't like the look of it." Marin said, "They're probably just waiting for someone." And she said it in an ordinary voice. And after the old woman went home, Marin stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking down without turning on the light. Saturday morning, when she opened the door to get the newspaper for her grandmother, there was an envelope lying on the floor directly beneath the door slot. It was white, medium-sized, with no stamp, no recipient's name, nothing written on it at all. Inside was only a photograph printed on ordinary paper. The picture had been taken from a distance, and slightly off-angle. It showed Rosalind Whitlock sitting on the green-painted wooden bench in Dvorak Park, the second bench from the entrance on 21st Street, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes turned toward the line of trees. It was where Delphine usually took her to sit on sunny mornings. Marin stood in the apartment hallway holding the photograph for a while. Then she folded it in half, slipped it into the pocket of her sweater, went back inside, and told her grandmother, "It's cold today. How about we stay home and listen to music, Grandma?" She didn't call anyone. She didn't say a single word to Gideon Marchetti about it. Not that day, not for the entire week that followed. But in Cicero, in the room above the bakery, Rafferty Doyle already knew about the car that had parked there for 3 nights, and about the envelope before Marin had even finished folding the photograph. And he hadn't told Gideon anything. Rafferty Doyle kept it to himself for 3 days, before placing the photograph on the table in front of Gideon, and he set it down with 2 fingers, the way a man puts down something dirty. He said, "3 nights in a row," he said. "Second bench from 21st Street." He said, "Let me handle it. You don't need to know anything else." Gideon said, "No." He picked up the photograph, looked at it for about 5 breaths, then asked, "Which side?" Rafferty said the other side had hired outside help, that the point man was someone named Halloran, a man who did investigative work for investment funds, with an office on Ogden Street, and that this Wednesday night he would be at Warehouse 7 in the Cicero Industrial District to receive a shipment of records. Gideon said, "I'm going." Rafferty said, "I'll send 2 men with you." Gideon said, "No." He went on foot. Warehouse 7 stood at the end of a broken asphalt road, its brick walls painted gray, the roll-up door raised about 5 feet. Inside, it was colder than outdoors because the concrete held the cold, and no one bothered heating a place used only for stacking crates. There were 4 men. Halloran sat on the edge of a makeshift plywood table, while the other 3 stood spaced around the room. When Gideon walked in, no one had heard a car because there hadn't been one, and that alone made the 3 standing men shift their footing almost at the same time. He didn't greet anyone. He walked to the plywood table, unbuttoned his wool coat, and placed a thin file held together with a metal clip on the surface. He didn't open it. He said, "Your brother's name is Devlin." Halloran said nothing. Gideon said, "For 3 years, he's owed money to 2 places on the south side, 1 lender in Indiana, and last month he borrowed a 4th time to pay off the 3rd. He said, "I have the names of the lenders. I have the amounts. I have the dates." He said, "If these papers leave my hands, he loses his professional license within 2 weeks, and within 6 months, he loses his house." There was no sound in the warehouse except the wind slipping beneath the edge of the roll-up door. Halloran opened his mouth to speak. Gideon raised one hand to signal that it wasn't his turn yet. Then he did the thing the other 3 men would later retell incorrectly, at least 10 different ways. He picked up the file, pushed it over the edge of the table so it fell onto the concrete floor, then placed his foot on top of it and pressed down exactly once, not hard. He said, "My father would have gone after your family." He said, "I stop with you. That's the whole difference between him and me, and I want you to remember that I showed you I have this, so you understand that not using it is a choice, not because I'm afraid to." His foot remained on the papers. He said, "Now let's talk about the theater." He said, "I know your side is waiting for a scandal before the signing date, and I know why. I haven't said it here because I still want to see who says it first. But there's one thing I'm saying right now." He said, "There's a woman in a gray wool coat, worn thin at the elbows, who lives on the 7th floor of a building with no elevator in Pilsen." He said, "For the last 3 nights, a car has been parked outside her building." He said, "An envelope was pushed under her door." He said, "I'm not asking who took the photograph inside it, because I don't need to know." He said, "What I need is for there to be no car on that street from tonight forward. No more envelopes, no one sitting inside a vehicle looking up at the 7th floor. He said, "If I have to come back to this warehouse a second time, I won't be putting anything on the table." Then he lifted his foot. He bent down, picked up the file now marked with concrete dust, folded it in half, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He told Halloran, "You should call your brother this weekend. Not because of me, because he needs someone to call him." Then he turned and walked out with the same measured pace he had used when he came in. Outside, about 15 steps from the roll-up door, in the darkness beside a freight container, Maren Whitlock was standing. She had been told to stay in the car 2 blocks away and not get out no matter what happened. She had managed to sit there for 4 minutes, then she opened the car door. She arrived in time to hear everything, and she stood there with both hands clenched inside the pockets of her coat, looking through the gap beneath the roll-up door, watching a man stand among 4 others in a cold warehouse and make every one of them hold their breath without raising his voice once. She had seen him kneel beside her grandmother at the theater. She had heard him tell the story about the scarf and the woman holding the violin, and now she was seeing the rest of him, the part he had never told her about, and something cold and heavy began rising very slowly inside her chest. For the first time since the night in Box 9, Maren Whitlock was afraid of that man. Gideon Marchetti's phone vibrated before dawn, at the kind of hour when a ringing phone could only carry one kind of news. He recognized Margot Ellery's number before his eyes were fully open. She said exactly 4 sentences. She said the attorney representing the Ashgrove side in the Ardmore deal was in the emergency department at Mercy Hospital. She said the police had been there since the night before. She said people were asking about his connection to Gideon's company. Then she said the 4th sentence, and she said it more slowly than the first 3. "I need you to tell me right now whether you knew anything about this." Gideon sat up on the edge of the bed in the darkness. He said, "No." Margot said, "I believe you, but you understand that doesn't matter anymore, don't you?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to, because both people on that call had already seen the full consequence of it spreading out in front of them all at once. From that moment forward, everything Gideon had in his hands became something he could no longer use. The theater system records, the capitalized notation in Maren's file, Curtis Ballard's admission in front of 60 witnesses, all of it still existed exactly as it had on paper. But from now on, whenever any of it was introduced, the first thing any lawyer would do wouldn't be to read it. The first thing they would do would be to ask the court who stood behind it. And that night, the man standing behind it had just become a name connected to a bed in an emergency department. The other side wouldn't have to prove the records were false. They would only have to stand up and say 3 words, coerced testimony, and everything else would collapse on its own. Margot said, "I have to prepare for the possibility that all the evidence gets excluded." Gideon said, "I know," she said, "and if the evidence gets excluded, those 700 and some people will never have their names in any record at all." Gideon said, "I know." He ended the call. He didn't turn on the light. He sat in the dark for about 10 minutes. And during those 10 minutes, he didn't think about the contract, didn't think about the Cicero warehouse, didn't think about Halloran. He thought about a 63-year-old man who walked with a slight lean because of a replaced hip. A man who had stood behind 3 generations of men in Gideon's family. A man who had placed the photograph on the table with 2 fingers and said, "Let me handle it," and who had received 1 word from Gideon in return: "No." Across the city, in a room with windows overlooking the hospital parking lot, Inspector Orrin Baskett stood with a cup of machine coffee in his hand and listened as a charge nurse read back the time the patient had been brought in. He didn't write it down. He had been writing things like this down for 9 years, and over those 9 years he had built a diagram inside his head, names inside boxes, thin lines connecting one box to another, and there had always been exactly 1 blank space in the center of that diagram that he had never been able to fill. Tonight he looked at that empty box and, for the first time, saw a line running toward it. He didn't feel pleased. That was what bothered him most as he drove back to the station while the sky began to lighten. He had been waiting for this for 9 years, and when it finally came, it came through a woman in a gray sweater and an old lady who had forgotten what day it was. And Baskett had been doing the job long enough to know that cases arriving that way often ended with the right person getting arrested, while the thing that should have been fixed remained exactly where it had always been. By 7 o'clock that morning, Rafferty Doyle called. He said only 1 sentence: "Don't do anything. Let me turn myself in." Gideon watched Rafferty's name on the screen until it went dark, and he didn't answer. Maren heard the news about the lawyer on the 6 o'clock radio broadcast while she was standing in the kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil, and she stayed perfectly still until the report ended, one hand resting on the lid of the kettle. She didn't call anyone. She poured the water, made tea for her grandmother, set the cup beside Rosalind's right hand the way she did every morning, then went back into the kitchen, tore a sheet of bread wrapping paper from the drawer, smoothed it flat against the plastic tabletop, and sat down with a ballpoint pen. For 4 years, she had managed Camilla Ashgrove's schedule. For 4 years, she had been the first person to see every appointment added and every appointment removed. The person who ordered the cars, confirmed the addresses, and told the drivers which entrance had the private elevator. No one had ever thought to hide anything from her, because before you can hide something from a person, you first have to remember that person exists. She started with the easiest part. On the bread wrapping paper, she drew 3 columns. The first column was for appointments canceled less than an hour before they were supposed to begin. Over 4 years, the number was very small because Camilla hated canceling almost as much as she hated being made to wait. Maren remembered 11. She remembered every one, because each time, she had been the person who had to call and apologize. Of those 11, one was different from all the others, because it was the only time Maren herself hadn't been told the reason, and the only time Camilla had personally removed the appointment from the system instead of asking her to do it. The meeting had been scheduled for a rainy afternoon, and the person who had been canceled on was the head of the company's own real estate valuation department. The second column was for names that appeared on the calendar that Maren didn't recognize. In the 6 weeks before the theater's reopening night, one name had appeared 3 times. No title, no company, only an abbreviation and a single initial. All 3 meetings were breakfasts. All 3 were outside the office. All 3 had been booked at places where no one on the 41st floor ever went for breakfast. The first had been at a place on Ogden Street. Maren sat a little straighter after she finished writing the word Ogden. The third column was for car rides. She closed her eyes and worked backward month by month, because she remembered addresses the way other people remembered their mother's phone number. The airport, the building on LaSalle Street, a restaurant in the Gold Coast, a private clinic in Streeterville, and once, exactly once, a car she had booked to an address in the Cicero Industrial District, leaving near dusk, waiting there for 40 minutes, then returning. That day, she had asked for confirmation because she thought she had typed the postal code wrong. Camilla had said, "Just book it." Maren had booked it. She set the pen down. She looked at the 3 columns on the bread wrapping paper and began drawing lines between them. The abbreviated name that appeared 3 times over 6 weeks, always near Ogden Street. The car ride to the Cicero Industrial District, waiting there, with no obvious reason for an investment fund executive to be doing business there. And the last-minute cancellation, with the head of real estate valuation, canceled exactly 9 days before the theater purchase agreement was supposed to be signed. She watched the 3 lines converge. Then, in the blank space below, she wrote a question, not an answer, because she was careful enough to know she hadn't earned the right to have an answer yet. She wrote, "If you're buying a building, why would you cancel the meeting with the person who knows what that building is worth?" From the living room, Rosalind asked what day it was. Maren said, "Tuesday, Grandma." Then she sat there a little longer. And while she sat, she thought something she had never once thought during all 4 years on the 41st floor. She thought about how, all that time, no one in that building could remember her full name. No one ever asked where she went on weekends. No one noticed when she changed her glasses. And because of that, they had entered door codes right in front of her. They had talked on the phone with her standing 2 steps away. They had left their calendars open on the screen when they went outside to smoke. For 4 years, everything had passed in front of her because, to them, she had been no more noticeable than a chair in the room. She folded the bread wrapping paper into quarters, slipped it into the inside pocket of her sweater, and went back out to pour more tea for her grandmother. Otis Fairbanks lived in a 2-story wooden house in Berwyn, with a child's bicycle leaning crookedly against the front steps. And when he opened the door, he didn't ask Maren who she was, didn't ask how she knew his address, didn't ask what she wanted. He looked at her for about 2 seconds and said, "You're 3 weeks late," he said. "I've been waiting for you since that night." Then he opened the door wider and stepped back to let her in. His kitchen had a round table covered with a flower-printed plastic tablecloth and an old radio that was turned off. He poured coffee for both of them without asking whether she wanted any. He sat down, placed both hands on the table, and told the story from the beginning, without circling around it, without apologizing first, without lowering his voice at any point. He said someone had approached him in the employee parking lot about 5 weeks before reopening night. The person hadn't given him a business card. The person had said it was a very small thing, that all they needed was for a conflict to appear in the ticketing system on one seat in the box section that particular night. Enough of a conflict that an usher would have to call a supervisor, and enough that some guest would get upset. The person had said no one would really be harmed. The ticket would be refunded. At worst, someone would have one unpleasant evening. Otis said, "I knew it was wrong the moment I heard it. I took the money anyway. I'm not going to pretend I wrestled with my conscience for a long time." I agreed in less than a minute. He said, "My daughter needed heart surgery. The theater's insurance cut the upper tier coverage this year, and the amount they offered me was exactly the difference." He said that once and left it there. He didn't repeat it. He didn't explain any further. He said, "I chose the seat. They told me to pick one that was likely to have an ordinary customer buying an individual ticket. I chose box 9, seat 2, because I knew that patrons sat there every season and I knew she'd make a scene. I figured the two sides would argue. Management would come down. The papers would run a few lines the next day about the newly reopened theater already having problems, and that would be the end of it." He stopped. He said, "I didn't account for there being an old woman." He said, "I was guarding the left entrance that night, and I heard the sound that old woman made when the case hit the floor, and right then I understood what I'd sold." Then Otis Fairbanks told Maren the part she had never considered. He said, "When the man in the black wool coat handed me that card and told me to take it to the control room, I knew that if that code went through, they'd open the entire system log, and if they opened the system log, sooner or later they'd trace it back to me. I knew that as surely as I knew my own hands. I still took the card, and I still ran up those 2 flights of stairs." He said, "I'm no hero, ma'am. I'm just a man who turned himself in before anyone realized that's what he was doing." He stood, pulled open the second drawer of the kitchen cabinet, and took out a sealed envelope with the theater's legal name and address written on it, already stamped, never mailed. He placed it on the table. He said, "I wrote this 3 weeks ago. I carried it to the mailbox 4 times. 4 times I brought it back home." He didn't say why. He didn't need to. That afternoon, in a conference room on LaSalle Street, Margot Ellery placed a set of architectural drawings and a contract page with one clause circled in pencil on the table in front of Gideon. She said, "They're not buying the theater." She said the building sat on the last parcel in that district, whose allowable height hadn't yet been increased, and what they were actually paying for was the development rights above it, keeping the limestone facade, gutting everything behind it, and building 40 floors of apartments. Then she turned to the page with the penciled circle and read the clause. If, before transfer, the property becomes involved in a public incident that damages its operating reputation, the purchase price will be reduced by 40%. She looked up and said, "I checked the list of people who approved this clause. There are 6 members of their board. Camilla Ashgrove isn't one of the 6. She knew nothing about it." Gideon looked at the page for a long time. Then he said, "So they needed someone arrogant enough to guarantee she'd make a scene over that exact seat, and they already had her inside their own house." The first snowstorm of the season came on Thursday night, earlier than forecast and heavier than forecast, and by 8 o'clock 18th Street was white all the way to the curb. Maren had to go down to the pharmacy on Ashland Street to pick up her grandmother's prescription. Delphine Rouse came over to stay with Rosalind as she always did, bringing the sweater she was still knitting. It happened in the common hallway. Delphine stepped outside to take out a bag of trash, slipped on a streak of melted snow someone had tracked in from outside, and fell. Her right wrist broke. Someone in the building called an ambulance. Delphine was in too much pain to speak. She could only point toward the door of apartment 702. No one understood what she was trying to say. The ambulance arrived. The paramedics brought in a stretcher. Neighbors crowded into the hallway. Radios crackled, and the freight elevator went up and down. During those 30 minutes, the door to apartment 702 remained slightly open, unlocked, and no one noticed. Rosalind Whitlock rose from her chair. She heard the voices in the hallway, and thought they were the sounds of an audience taking their seats. She put on the thin beige wool robe hanging behind the door. She picked up the instrument case, leaning against the foot of the cabinet. She went into the stairwell, walked down 7 flights, went out through the rear door, and turned left, in the direction she had walked when she was still young, and the building where she worked was lit every night. In her mind, her daughter was going on stage tonight, and she couldn't be late. Maren came home at 8:45. The door was ajar. The living room light was still on. The chair was empty. The space beside the cabinet was empty. She ran down all 7 flights of stairs, 2 steps at a time, one hand gripping the railing, and she called Gideon Marchetti while her feet were still moving, and when he answered, her voice broke on the 3rd word. He said, "Stay where you are." He said, "I'm coming right now." He didn't call the police. He made 4 calls. The first was to Rafferty Doyle. The second was to a man in Bridgeport who managed 3 trucking crews. The third was to a man on the west side who owned 4 auto repair shops. The fourth was to Otis Fairbanks. He said the same thing on all 4 calls. 79 years old, beige robe, carrying an instrument case, on foot, coming from Pilsen. 40 minutes later, 60 people were spread across 7 neighborhoods. Trucks were parked across intersections to block the wind. Flashlights swept through alleys, beneath overpasses, and along the fence behind St. Adalbert Church. That night, men walked into the wind with blankets in their trunks, men whose names would each bring up at least a page if someone searched them at a city police station. No one asked why. Nella Pruitt got the call while she was washing dishes in Bridgeport, and she drove across the city through the snow with one windshield wiper broken. She walked along Halsted Street, calling Rosalind's name until her voice went hoarse. Otis Fairbanks didn't go searching. He drove straight to the theater, unlocked the alley door, ran up to the control room, and turned on every exterior light in the building. Light poured along the limestone columns. Lights traced the restored gold lettering. The marquee lights, the sign lights, the lights on both sides of the front steps. All of them came on at once in the middle of the night, and the building rose out of the snow like a ship. Wendell Hoyt called and asked him what the hell he was doing. Otis said, "So she can see the way." Amos Pike found her. He arrived last because he had heard about the search through someone he knew at the fire department, and he didn't search the main streets. He went straight to the theater and around to the back alley, because 31 years on the job had taught him that when people become confused, they don't go where their minds remember. They go where their bodies remember. Rosalind was sitting on the steps outside the artist's entrance, beside the blue-painted door with the dent in the lower right corner. Snow had gathered on the shoulders of her robe and in her hair. The instrument case rested in her lap, both arms wrapped around it, and she was singing. No words, very softly. 4 measures, every note right, every beat right, repeating them over and over. Amos Pike lowered himself onto one knee on the step and didn't touch her. He said, "Ma'am, would it be all right if I sat here with you for a little while?" The old woman said, "Of course," but quietly. "It's about to begin," he said. "Yes, ma'am." Then he reached for his radio and spoke 3 words into it. "We found her." Gideon's car arrived less than 4 minutes later and stopped diagonally across the alley. Maren got out first, ran to her grandmother, dropped to her knees, and wrapped her arms around her. Rosalind patted her granddaughter's back and said, "Don't cry, sweetheart. Your mother played beautifully." Gideon Marchetti came toward them afterward, more slowly. He didn't say anything. He took off his black wool coat and draped it around the old woman's shoulders, pulling the collar up to cover the back of her neck, and he stood there in the snow, wearing nothing but his thin shirt beneath the glow of the theater lights, beside the door his mother had walked through every night for 22 years. The hospital kept Rosalind overnight to monitor her body temperature, and they put her in a room on the 3rd floor with 2 beds, though the other bed remained empty. Close to 1 o'clock in the morning, she finally fell asleep. Maren sat in the plastic chair beside the window, the instrument case resting on her lap, because she had been holding it ever since they got into the ambulance, and hadn't once thought to put it down. Somewhere in the hallway, the wheels of a cart passed by, and gradually faded into the distance. She stared at the latch on the left side for a long time, then she opened it. She hadn't opened this case in 7 years. The instrument was still lying exactly where it had always lain, the 4th string completely slack now. The varnish beneath the chin rest faded into an oval patch by the sweat of a woman who had been gone for a long time. Maren reached out and touched it, then pulled her hand back. The moss-green velvet lining at the bottom of the case had come loose at one corner, probably from the fall at the theater. She slipped a finger underneath it, intending to smooth it back into place. Her fingertip touched the edge of paper. She pulled it out. It was a small envelope, the paper evenly yellowed with age, and on the front was her grandmother's name written in the slanting handwriting. Maren recognized immediately, even though she hadn't seen it in 7 years. The envelope wasn't sealed. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded into thirds. She opened it. The letter had been written in ink, the handwriting growing slightly hurried in the final few lines. "Mom, I'm writing this in the dressing room. We've still got 20 minutes before my section goes on. I just went into the hallway to get some water, and I saw one of the cleaning women I say hello to every night, standing out there with her son. They'd been asked to wait outside while the seating was rearranged. I saw the boy. He looked about 8 or 9. He was wearing a coat much too thin for a night like this. He wasn't crying, Mom. He was just standing there with one hand holding his mother's, looking through the crack in the door into the auditorium. I stood at the end of the hallway and watched him for about half a minute. Mom, I can't play tonight if I leave him standing out there. I gave her my 2 complimentary tickets. I know you saved those tickets for you and Aunt Bess, and I'm sorry, and please don't be angry with me. I gave the boy my scarf too, the one you edged for me last winter. I'll buy another one." The letter ended there, without a signature. Only a short stroke of the pen like the mark someone makes when they're suddenly called away. Maren read it again from the beginning. Then she read it a third time. She lowered the paper onto her lap and sat very still. And the only sound in the room was the steady beeping of the heart monitor near the head of the bed. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Gideon Marchetti arrived. He stood in the doorway holding a paper bag, and he didn't come inside until Maren nodded. He said, "I brought this. I meant to bring it from the night at the theater, but I didn't know what I was bringing it for." From the paper bag, he took out a wool scarf, pale gray, loosely woven, worn at both ends, with a line of dark blue hand stitching running all the way around the edge. He said, "I've kept it for 25 years. I've never washed it." He didn't say anything else. Maren picked up the sheet of paper from her lap and handed it to him. He read it. He read slowly, and somewhere around the middle, he had to stop and look out the window for a while before he could continue. When he finished, he folded the paper along the same 3 old creases and handed it back to her, and his hands weren't entirely steady. On the bed, Rosalind opened her eyes. She looked at the two of them, didn't recognize the man standing beside the window, and asked Maren, "Who is this young man, sweetheart?" Maren said, "He's my friend, Grandma." The old woman nodded politely and said, "Hello." Then her eyes fell on the scarf draped over Gideon's arm. She leaned forward. She said, "Let me see that." Gideon placed the scarf in her hands. Rosalind turned the edge inside out. She brought it closer to her eyes. She ran one finger along the dark blue stitching that bordered it, following the entire length of one side and then around the corner, very slowly, the way someone reads a line of raised lettering. At the second corner, she stopped. She said, "This stitch is backward." She said, "You don't edge fabric this way. This is a costume shop stitch. You sew it backward so the edge won't rub against a child's neck." Then she looked up, and her face softened, and she spoke in the voice of someone who had just found something she had misplaced a very long time ago. She said, "Rosalind sewed this." She said, "Rosalind Whitlock sewed this downstairs in the basement, for Iona." 3 days later, in the conference room on LaSalle Street, Margot Ellery placed a thick stack of papers on the table and turned it so Maren could see. She said, "I need you to know this, because if you hear it from somewhere else, it's going to look very different." It was the transfer agreement for the Ardmore Theater. At 3 places marked with yellow tabs, there were already signatures in blue ink, firm and decisive, with a date written beneath each one. Maren looked at that date for about 4 seconds, then raised her eyes. She said, "This was reopening night." Margot said, "Yes." She said, "It was signed at 4 o'clock that afternoon, at the coffee shop across from the theater, 2 hours before curtain." Gideon sat at the head of the table and didn't look away from her. He said, "I sold it. I signed the papers before I went inside. I went in to see it one last time." Maren asked, "Then what about now?" Margot turned to the final page and pointed to a marked paragraph. She said there was a clause allowing the seller to cancel within 30 days of signing. She said it came with a termination payment. She read the amount. Then she added one more sentence in the voice of an accountant rather than a lawyer. "That figure is almost exactly equal to what Marchetti Holdings will lose when its partners pull out over the next 3 months. So in practical terms, he's paying this price twice." She said the cancellation notice had been sent the morning of the second day after that night. Maren said nothing. She reached out, turned back to the page with the signatures, looked at the date one more time, then closed the cover of the agreement. That evening, in Gideon's kitchen in Oak Park, Rafferty Doyle sat in the chair he had been sitting in for 20 years, the one near the stove, and he took the bottle of liquor from the cabinet himself, took out 2 glasses, poured for both of them, then pushed one glass across the table. He didn't ask why Gideon had called him there. He said, "I read the paper this morning." He said, "They're saying the police are expanding the investigation, and the company's name came up." He said, "I know you've been talking to your lawyer for 2 days straight." Gideon didn't touch his drink. He said, "Did you do it alone, or was there someone else?" Rafferty said, "Alone." Gideon said, "You knew I'd already told you no." Rafferty said, "I knew." He turned his glass half a circle against the tabletop. Then he said, "Son, the first time I held you, your eyes weren't even open yet. I stood in the church the day your mother died. I stood on the right side of your father's coffin, and in 20 years of working under you, I've never asked you a single question. Now I'm asking one. Are you really going to hand me over to them because of one seat in a theater?" Gideon looked up. He said, "No," he said, "because of 712 seats you didn't know existed." Rafferty sat very still. Gideon said, "That night in Box 9, if I'd let it pass, it would have been nothing more than one bad evening for a woman and an old lady. I ordered the system logs opened because I thought I'd find one mistake. I found a habit," he said. "Now all of it is sitting on Margot's desk. And the only thing that can make it useless in court is one very simple question the other side will ask at the very first hearing. They'll ask who was behind it. And if I stay silent, the answer will have your name in it, and none of those other names will ever be read aloud." He said, "I don't have a way to save both, Uncle." Rafferty gave one slow nod. He finished the liquor in his glass, set it gently on the table, then stood. He took the coat draped over the back of his chair, put it on, and fastened the top 2 buttons, moving slowly because his right shoulder wouldn't lift as high as it used to. No one stopped him. There was no one else in the house. He walked as far as the kitchen door, then paused at the threshold with one hand resting on the wooden frame, and he didn't fully turn around. He said, "Serafina would be proud of you." He said, "Your father wouldn't." Then he said the last sentence, and there was no bitterness in it, only weariness. "You're going to have to choose between those 2 people, son. You can't keep them both." He stepped outside, and the sound of his footsteps on the snow-covered gravel path carried clearly through the night, growing fainter and fainter until it was gone. The audit lasted 11 days and covered all 14 properties held by the corporation: 4 theaters, 2 old movie houses, a small stadium on the west side, and 7 event centers. Frances Dunmore, the chief operating officer, presented the findings in a windowless conference room with 9 people seated around the table. She read every number exactly as it appeared, adding nothing and taking nothing away. 1,847 manual overrides of locked seats in 24 months. Of those, 712 involved separating an elderly person or someone requiring assistance from the companion responsible for caring for them. 664 records had been closed using the consent checkbox. The number of cases that had received compensation during those 24 months was 9. She left the presentation frozen on the final slide and added one sentence in the voice of someone who had been doing this work for 30 years and had learned how to say difficult things in language that was easier to swallow. She said, "Ladies and gentlemen, measured against the total number of tickets sold over 2 years, this is a statistical error, and legal will use exactly that phrase." No one answered immediately. Gideon Marchetti sat at the far end of the table, one hand resting on the unopened file in front of him, and he said exactly one sentence. He said, "712 isn't an error, Miss Dunmore. 712 is a neighborhood." He didn't say anything else after that. He didn't explain. He didn't repeat himself. He simply pushed the file toward Margot Ellery and said, "Publish it." The disclosure went public on a Tuesday morning, before any newspaper had time to catch the scent of it. Every number was posted on the corporation's official website, without a single line of the kind that said, "We regret if anyone felt," without the word "if" anywhere in it. Beneath the statement was an address where anyone who had ever been moved from a seat could write, and a telephone number that rang into a room staffed by 19 people. At the bottom of the document was one signature, a full name, without a title attached. By noon that day, the 19-person room had received more than 2,000 calls. Camilla Ashgrove testified in the 3rd week. She came alone, without private counsel, carrying copies of emails she herself had never received. And she sat for 4 hours, answering every question about the 40% price reduction clause that 6 members of her company's board had approved behind her back. When she came out of the room, she found Marin in the hallway. The 2 women stood about 3 steps apart. Camilla said, "I'm not doing this for you. I want that understood." Then she said the rest, and her voice went dry halfway through. She said, "I'm doing it because they treated me exactly the way I treated you in that box that night. They let me walk into a room they had already arranged. They knew what I would do, and they stood outside waiting. For 4 years, I didn't see you. I lasted exactly 1 week, being the person no one saw." She didn't apologize. She gave one small nod and walked toward the elevators. The cost came exactly as the experienced people had predicted. 3 longtime partners withdrew their capital within 6 weeks, citing portfolio restructuring. 2 transportation companies lost master contracts with a warehouse chain in Indiana, shortly after the corporation's name appeared on the front page beside the 2 words "under investigation." The bank tightened its credit line. 1 insurer declined to renew. When the accountants stopped counting at the end of the quarter, Marchetti Holdings had lost 40% of what it had been worth before reopening night, and not one of them dared say that number aloud in a room where Gideon was present. That Saturday afternoon, Gideon drove to Cicero and went upstairs to the room above the bakery. Down below, People were still baking bread, and the smell of flour still rose through the wooden floorboards exactly as it always had. He pushed open the door and stood there for a while. The long wooden table was still in the center of the room. Around it were 6 chairs, lined up neatly, pushed close against the edge of the table, and no one was sitting in any of them. That March brought one strange week of sunshine. Real sunshine. The kind that melted the snow piled along the windowsill into thin streams and filled the entire Pilsen apartment with a kind of light it hadn't known all winter. On Thursday afternoon, Rosalind sat in the armchair beside the window, a blanket spread across her knees, her eyes resting on the red brick wall outside with its faded painted bird. She hadn't asked what day it was for 3 days. Maren brought the instrument case out and placed it on the table. She opened the right latch, then the left, the latch that had been fitted with a new catch and now closed properly on the first try. She took out the violin. She tuned it very slowly, one string at a time, tilting her head to listen, tightening, listening again. The 4th string took the longest. She stood, settled the violin between her shoulder and chin, and remained like that for about 10 seconds before lifting the bow, because she hadn't made that motion in 7 years, and her body remembered it more clearly than she wanted it to. Then she drew the bow across the strings. 4 measures. Only those 4 measures. Nothing more. The first note rasped slightly at the bow change. The second was clean. In the armchair, Rosalind turned her head. She looked at her granddaughter for a while. Then she began to sing along, softly, without words, every note right, every beat right. Her voice thin and rough, but never straying once. Grandmother and granddaughter went through all 4 measures together. Maren lowered the bow. The old woman smiled and said, "You play beautifully, Iona," she said. "Mother heard you." Then she closed her eyes. Maren placed the violin on the table, sat down on the carpeted step beside the armchair, laid both of her hands over her grandmother's, and stayed there until the sunlight on the windowsill had moved all the way to the edge of the wall. The funeral was held at St. Adalbert Church on a windy morning. Delphine Rouse came with her arm still in a cast. Nella Pruitt came. Amos Pike came, wearing the suit he only wore to funerals, and he stood in the back row. Curtis Ballard lost his job during the 2nd week after reopening night. He didn't appeal. He didn't ask the union for help. He didn't request any kind of review hearing. He signed the papers and walked out to the parking lot. 9 months later, a 4-page handwritten letter arrived at the corporation's office, folded inside an ordinary envelope, with a return address from a residential building in Berwyn. Margot Ellery read it as required, then carried it into Gideon's office and placed it in front of him without saying anything. The first 3 pages were filled with bitterness. Ballard wrote about 19 years of work, about the nights he stayed until 2 o'clock in the morning looking for a lost suitcase, about the 60-mile drive through a snowstorm to return a hearing aid no newspaper had ever written about. He wrote that people had taken those 19 years and weighed them against 15 minutes in a box section, and the 15 minutes had won, and he didn't know what he was supposed to do with that. He wrote that on some mornings he sat in his car in the parking lot before his shift would have started, and his hands shook from anger. The 4th page was completely different. He wrote that his 12-year-old son had asked why his father didn't work at the theater anymore. He wrote that he had considered 3 different answers and chosen the true one. He told his son that his father had moved someone from her seat because he knew she couldn't do anything to him. He wrote that the boy had been quiet for a while, then asked, "Did you apologize to her?" He wrote that he had said yes, and he wrote that the boy had said, "Then it's okay, Dad," and gone off to watch television, while Ballard himself had needed to step outside onto the porch and stand there for a while, because it wasn't okay, and because one day that boy would be standing behind some counter with a line of people waiting in front of him, and Ballard needed him to be better than his father had been. His final sentence said that he wasn't asking for anything. Gideon answered in 2 lines. "Mr. Ballard, the truth is the whole job. Keep telling it." Then he called an acquaintance in Rockford who managed a regional freight warehouse, and he didn't mention a single name. He only asked one very specific question, about one very specific position, then ended the call. 3 weeks later, Curtis Ballard received a phone call. 4 months after that, a close, cropped, salt-and-pepper-haired man named Otis Fairbanks started working at the same warehouse, on the night shift, on the same crew as Ballard. The 2 men worked together for 3 years. Neither of them ever knew why he had been hired, and neither ever asked the other. 3 years later, the Ardmore Theater no longer belonged to Marchetti Holdings. The entire building had been transferred into a community trust overseen by 9 trustees, including a retired music teacher, a carpenter from Pilsen, and 2 representatives from the ward. Gideon Marchetti held no seat on that board. He had attached only one condition to the transfer agreement, that before the curtain rose at the first performance of every month, someone had to walk onto the stage and read aloud the number of seat changes that had occurred during the previous month. Spoken out loud, never projected onto a screen. People told him that would create 60 very uncomfortable seconds every month. He said, "Exactly. That's the point." Down in the basement, the old costume storage room was cleared out and converted into rehearsal space for a program called Ardmore Free Strings, offering free music lessons to children from the surrounding neighborhoods. That year, the program had 90 students. The fund supporting it was named for Iona Whitlock. On a Saturday afternoon in June, when the final rehearsal of the term was held on the main stage itself, an 11-year-old girl with her hair braided into 2 plaits sat in the second violin section. She was Otis Fairbanks's daughter, healthy, and laughing through almost the entire rehearsal because the child beside her kept drawing the bow sideways into her shoulder. Maren Whitlock sat in box 9, seat 2. Gideon sat beside her in seat 1. Their wedding had been held in the theater lobby the previous fall. 40 guests, no reporters, no announcement. Amos Pike walked the bride the final few steps. Delphine Rouse sat in the front row and cried more than everyone else combined. Nella Pruitt handled the guest reception, and she welcomed each person with the exacting care of someone determined to do perfectly something she had once done wrong. That afternoon, just as rehearsal ended, a boy around 9 years old named Tobias missed a note in the final measure, heard the sound he had made, then burst out laughing, and the entire row laughed with him. The boy ran up the box staircase, poked his head through the velvet curtain, looked around once, and asked, "Ma'am, this is the best seat, right?" Maren turned toward him. She said, "No, sweetheart, there isn't any best seat here. There's only your seat. You keep your ticket safe, then you sit in your place, and no one gets to take it away from you. Not even the richest person in this room." Tobias nodded as though this were something obvious he had known all along, then ran back down to his friends. This story leaves behind something very simple that any of us can carry with us. A person's worth isn't in the clothes they wear. It isn't in the seat someone assigns them. And it isn't in whether they have enough power to make someone else afraid of them. It lives in the way we look at another human being during those few brief seconds when we know nothing about them yet. Some wounds don't come from cruelty. They come from people simply not bothering to see one another. And sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness, a scarf, 2 tickets given away, 1 sentence spoken at the right moment, can travel through decades and return in time to save an entire life. So be kind when no one is watching. Speak when you see something wrong. And remember that the person standing in front of you is always carrying a story you haven't heard yet. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so you can hear more meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Which detail stayed with you the most? Or have you ever met someone whose kindness changed your life? Someone you still haven't had the chance to thank? Please leave a few words in the comments. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.